when I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse in my navy dress blues. The room went dead silent. And then I heard it. My own father looked right at me from the front row and laughed. Beside him, my mother buried her face in her hands and sobbed. They thought I was walking in to be publicly disgraced, stripped of my rank, and ruined forever just to protect my golden boy brother. They thought the corrupt, multi-million-dollar empire they built was entirely untouchable. They expected me to swallow the blame and stay silent like I always did. But they didn't know what I was holding tightly inside my briefcase. And they certainly didn't expect the judge to call my name. In today's story, we are going to explore why true loyalty should never cost you your integrity, and how breaking free from a toxic family cycle is the ultimate act of courage. If you believe in standing up for the truth even when you have to stand completely alone, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Let's dive in. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse groaned as I pushed them open, the sound echoing like a final judgment through the cavernous hall. I was dressed in my full navy dress blues, the crisp fabric pulling taut across my shoulders, the polished silver of my medals catching the sterile, unforgiving glare of the fluorescent lights above. The moment my black heels clicked against the marble floor, the chaotic murmur of the gallery died instantly. The room went dead silent, and then, cutting through that heavy, expectant stillness, I heard it, a dry, mocking laugh. I didn't need to turn my head to know who it belonged to. It was my father, Arthur Vance. He sat in the front row, his arms crossed over his expensive tailored suit, his face twisted into a smirk of absolute certainty. Next to him, my mother, Claire, shrank into her seat. She buried her face in her trembling hands, her shoulders shaking with quiet, muffled sobs. They looked at me as if I were a ghost walking to my own execution. They thought they had won. They thought the man sitting at the defense table, my golden boy brother, Harrison, who wouldn't even meet my gaze, had successfully buried me. But they didn't know what I was holding tightly inside my leather briefcase. And they certainly didn't expect what the Honorable Judge Thomas Mercer was about to do. To understand how a family ends up on opposite sides of a federal courtroom, you have to understand the invisible ledgers we keep. In the Vance household, love was never unconditional. It was a currency, and I was chronically bankrupt. How many women know exactly what it feels like to be the invisible daughter? The one who does everything right, who follows the rules, who builds a life of quiet, steady honor, only to be constantly overshadowed by the towering, blinding light of the golden child. For as long as I could remember, Harrison was the sun, and I was just a cold rock orbiting in the dark. He was charismatic, ruthless, and brilliant, a defense contractor who made millions and bought my father's affection with sports cars and lavish vacations. I was the dedicated military officer, a woman who chose duty over wealth, a choice my father viewed as a fundamental failure of ambition. The match that lit this powder keg had been struck 3 weeks earlier, on a cold, rain-slicked Thanksgiving afternoon. I had driven straight to my parents' brain-falling estate in the suburbs after a grueling 48-hour shift at the naval base. I was exhausted, my uniform smelling faintly of ozone and stale coffee, craving nothing more than a warm meal and a moment of peace. Instead, I walked into a theater of excess. The dining room was suffocatingly warm, smelling of roasted sage and expensive wine. Crystal glasses clinked as Harrison held court at the head of the table, flanked by my father, who was looking at him with a level of pride he had never once directed at me. Another $30 million government contract secured, Harrison was boasting, swirling his bourbon. The Navy practically begged us for the new sonar integration software. It's a flawless system. My father raised his glass, his eyes gleaming. To the Vance legacy, he declared, his voice booming over the polite applause of extended relatives, building empires while others just push papers. He shot a brief, dismissive glance in my direction. Right, Eleanor. How are things down in the clerical pool? I forced a tight, polite smile, burying the familiar sting. I am a lead cyber investigator. Dad, it's a bit more than paperwork. He waved his hand dismissively, turning his attention immediately back to Harrison. My mother caught my eye from across the table, offering a small, apologetic, and utterly useless smile before looking down at her plate. It was the same silent apology she had given me my entire life. I retreated into my own thoughts, taking a sip of water, desperate for the evening to end. Then, the secure encrypted phone in my jacket pocket began to vibrate. It wasn't a standard ring. It was the rapid, staggered pulse of a Priority 1 security alert. My blood ran cold. I stepped away from the table, slipping out to the dimly lit hallway, and unlocked the screen. The text was stark and terrifying. There had been a massive, unauthorized data extraction from the Navy's classified sonar defense grid. Highly sensitive coordinates and stealth protocols had been downloaded and routed through a civilian server. I scrolled rapidly through the preliminary trace data, my eyes scanning the lines of raw code, my heart hammered against my ribs. Loud enough that I thought the whole house might hear it. The trace didn't lead to a foreign adversary or a faceless hacker collective. The IP address glowed in bright, condemning digital ink on my screen. It routed directly back to the private, encrypted servers of Advanced Defense Solutions, Harrison's company. I looked back through the doorway, watching my brother laugh as my father clapped him on the back. The air in my lungs turned to ash. The empire my father was toasting to was built on treason. The drive back to the naval base was a blur of flashing highway lights and the rhythmic, pounding thud of my own heartbeat. The warmth of the Thanksgiving dinner had been replaced by a chilling, absolute dread. When I walked into the Cyber Command Center, the room was a stark contrast to my parents' home. It was windowless, freezing cold, and humming with the relentless energy of giant server racks. This was my sanctuary, a place where truth was binary, where facts could not be manipulated by a charming smile or a father's preference. I logged into my secure terminal and began the painstaking work of dissecting the breach. Hour after hour, I followed the digital breadcrumbs. Harrison was smart, but arrogance always leaves a trail. He hadn't just hacked the system from the outside. He had opened a back door from the inside. But it was the method he used that truly broke my heart. The access logs showed that the firewall had been bypassed using an old, decommissioned military clearance code. I pulled up the personnel file attached to the code, and a black and white photograph of my late grandfather stared back at me. He had been a brilliant naval engineer, a man of profound integrity, and the only person in my family who had ever truly seen me. Harrison had used our grandfather's legacy, his sacred credentials, to steal state secrets and sell out his country. It felt like a physical blow, a desecration of the one pure memory I had left. "You look like you're staring down the barrel of a loaded gun," Vance, a steady voice, said from behind me. I turned to see Captain Sarah Hayes standing in the doorway. She was a formidable woman, a trailblazer who had fought her way up the ranks through sheer brilliance and an uncompromising moral compass. She was the mentor I desperately needed, the mother figure who demanded excellence rather than submission. I turned the monitor so she could see the logs. "It's my brother, ma'am. Harrison's company is the endpoint for the sonar data breach, and he used my grandfather's ghost clearance to do it." Captain Hayes's expression didn't change, but her eyes hardened. She understood immediately the impossible position I was in. "Do you have concrete proof? Digital footprints, time-stamped routing protocols, the works?" "It's undeniable." I swallowed hard, the reality of what I had to do settling over me like a lead weight. "I have to file the report. But you know what this means. My family." Captain Hayes stepped forward and placed a firm, grounding hand on my shoulder. "Eleanor, in a man's world, they will always expect you to back down when the pressure comes from family. They expect women to be the peacekeepers, to swallow the truth, to maintain the illusion of harmony. But true equality means holding everyone to the same standard of justice, no matter their gender, their wealth, or their title in your family tree. She squeezed my shoulder. Loyalty should never cost you your integrity. Show them a woman's honor doesn't flinch. Armed with her words, I didn't go to Harrison. I went to the source of the rot. Early the next morning, I drove to my father's downtown office. Arthur Vance sat behind a massive mahogany desk, looking annoyed by my unannounced arrival. I placed the printed data logs directly on his desk. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply laid out the facts, explaining exactly what Harrison had done, hoping against all my better judgment that my father would be horrified. I hoped the patriarch who preached about legacy would care that his son was committing treason. My father barely looked at the papers. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepled his fingers, and looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated coldness. I know, he said simply. The words hit me like a physical strike. You know, Dad, this is a federal crime. He stole classified defense systems. He secured a necessary advantage for a multi-million-dollar contract that benefits this entire family. My father shot back, his voice rising, thick with disdain. It was a calculated risk, and it would have been fine if you hadn't been the one sitting at that desk. He stood up, leaning over the desk to tower over me, a tactic of physical intimidation he had used my whole life. Family protects family, Eleanor. You are going to go back to your little base. You are going to delete those logs. And you are going to misdirect this investigation. Do you understand me? I will not commit a felony to cover for his greed, I said, my voice shaking, but my spine rigid. I am an officer of the United States Navy, my father scoffed, a sound dripping with contempt. You are a little girl playing dress-up in a uniform. If you walk out of this room and file that report, you are no longer my daughter. You will be nothing. I will make sure of it. I looked at the man who had raised me, realizing finally that there was nothing left to salvage. There was no love here, only a transaction I was no longer willing to make. I'd rather be nothing to you, Dad, than be a traitor to myself. I turned and walked out of the office, the sound of the heavy door clicking shut behind me, sealing my fate. I had chosen my integrity, but the war was only just beginning. I filed the official report the moment I returned to the naval base, bypassing standard chain-of-command protocols to send the encrypted dossier directly to the Inspector General's office. I knew the retaliation would be swift, but I had severely underestimated the sheer ruthlessness of the empire my father had built. By noon the following day, the blowback hit me like a runaway freight train. I was summoned to a sterile conference room where two internal affairs officers were waiting. Flanked by a smug civilian attorney I instantly recognized from my father's payroll. They did not ask me about the stolen sonar data. Instead, they asked me about my mental health. Harrison had not merely denied the allegations. He had launched a surgical, full-scale character assassination. His legal team filed a preemptive counterclaim, asserting that I had fabricated the digital footprint in a fit of hysterical jealousy, weaponizing my security clearance to destroy my brother out of deep-seated familial resentment. The strategy was as ancient as it was effective. When a woman speaks an inconvenient truth, do not debate the facts. Simply declare her emotionally unstable. They used my intense dedication to my career against me, painting my long hours and solitary life as symptoms of severe psychological distress. By the end of the hour, I was formally suspended pending a full psychological and operational review. I was forced to hand over my badge, my weapon, and my security credentials. Two armed guards escorted me off the premises like a common criminal. By the time I reached my car, the story had already leaked to the press. My phone erupted with notifications as news outlets ran sensationalized headlines about a disgraced military investigator targeting her own family's patriotic defense company. The isolation was absolute and suffocating. I sat in my driveway for hours, watching the sunset paint the sky in bruised hues of purple and black, wondering if my father was right. Perhaps I was just a little girl playing in a uniform, entirely powerless against the machinery of their wealth and influence. That night, a sharp knock at my front door pulled me from the spiral of my own despair. I opened it to find Captain Sarah Hayes standing on my porch, dressed in civilian clothes, her expression unreadable. She stepped inside without a word, pulling a sleek, encrypted tablet from her coat. "They took your badge, Eleanor, but they didn't take your brain," she said, her voice a low, commanding rasp. "And they certainly didn't take mine." I pulled a shadow copy of the physical security logs before Internal Affairs locked the system. She placed the tablet on my kitchen counter. "Digital footprints can be argued by high-priced tech lawyers. We need something analog, something undeniable." For the next 48 hours, kitchen became a makeshift command center. We scoured thousands of hours of routine-based security footage, looking for anything that tied Harrison to the physical network access point. The digital logs showed the breach happened at exactly 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. We pulled the body cam footage from the perimeter guards working that specific sector. Hours of static and boring patrols blurred together until, finally, we struck gold. At 1:58 a.m., a black sedan approached the secondary service gate. The guard's body cam captured the vehicle's license plate. It was registered to Vance Defense Solutions. The window rolled down, and though the driver's face was obscured by the shadows and a pulled-down baseball cap, the voice was unmistakable. It was Harrison. We enhanced the audio, capturing the clear, time-stamped exchange where Harrison handed the guard a thick envelope, stating, "Take a 30-minute walk, buddy. The cameras in Sector 4 are going offline for a maintenance cycle." You saw nothing. It was the smoking gun. It was the useful, irrefutable evidence that no high-priced lawyer could explain away as a hysterical woman's fabrication. Armed with the body cam footage, I walked into the preliminary hearing a week later feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The courtroom was small and suffocating, serving as a battleground for the pretrial motions to dismiss the case entirely. Harrison sat at the defense table, looking perfectly relaxed in a bespoke charcoal suit, whispering jokes to his lead attorney. My father sat directly behind him, projecting an aura of untouchable authority. When my military-appointed counsel presented the body cam footage to the judge, I waited for the color to drain from Harrison's face. Instead, his lawyers simply stood up and smoothly dismantled our smoking gun. He produced a stack of falsified flight manifests and hotel receipts, claiming Harrison had been in Chicago on the night in question. The lawyer argued that the voice on the tape was distorted, the face was unseen, and the car could have been driven by any rogue employee of the massive company. The judge, a conservative man who clearly played golf at the same country club as my father, ruled the body cam footage circumstantial and inadmissible for the final trial. The defeat was crushing. I watched my father smirk across the aisle, a terrifying reminder that the justice system was often blind, but it was rarely immune to the gravity of extreme wealth. I left the courthouse feeling entirely hollowed out. The final trial was scheduled to begin the next morning, and without the body cam footage, the case would rely solely on the digital logs. My father's legal team was fully prepared to bury under mountains of reasonable doubt and character attacks against me. I returned to my empty house as a heavy thunderstorm rolled in from the coast, the rain lashing aggressively against my windows. I poured a glass of cheap wine and sat in the dark, drafting my official letter of resignation from the Navy. I had fought the good fight, and I had lost. At midnight, the doorbell rang. It was a frantic, desperate sound. I opened the door and gasped. My mother, Claire, stood on my porch, completely soaked to the bone, her elegant trench coat ruined by the driving rain. In all my 34 years, I had never seen my mother leave the house without perfect hair and immaculate makeup. Now, she was trembling, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark, jagged rivers. I pulled her inside, wrapping a heavy blanket around her frail shoulders. She didn't speak immediately. She just stood in the center of my living room, weeping with a depth of sorrow that seemed to carry decades of silent suffering. "Mom, what happened? Did Dad do something?" I asked, my protective instincts instantly overriding the bitter resentment I had harbored toward her silence. She looked up at me, her eyes suddenly clear and fiercely resolved. "I have spent 40 years making myself small so your father could feel big," she whispered, her voice shaking but gaining strength with every word. "I watched him break my spirit, and I stood by and let him try to break yours, because I was terrified. But watching you stand up to him, watching you lose everything just to hold on to the truth, it broke the spell." Eleanor, she reached into her wet coat pocket and pulled out a small, silver flash drive, pressing it firmly into my palm. "Your father keeps us safe in his study. He thinks I don't know the combination, but I've known it for 15 years. I went in tonight after he fell asleep. I stared at the metal drive, my heart pounding against my ribs. "What is this?" "Mom, it's the insurance policy," she said, a bitter smile touching her lips. "Your father records all his private office phone calls. He likes to have leverage on his business partners. I copied the audio files from the week of the breach. Harrison called him the morning after he stole the data. He bragged about it, Eleanor. He bragged about selling the sonar coordinates to a foreign shell company, and he laughed about framing you." She reached up and touched my cheek, her hand cold but infinitely tender. "I am so sorry it took me this long to protect you, but I am here now. Burn their empire to the ground. My beautiful girl." The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse groaned as I pushed them open, the sound echoing like a final judgment through the cavernous hall. I was in my full navy dress blues, the fabric immaculately pressed, my medals catching the sterile fluorescent lights above. As I stepped over the threshold, the chaotic murmur of the gallery died instantly. The room went dead silent. And then, I heard it. A dry, mocking laugh echoing from the front row. It was my father, Arthur. He sat with his chest puffed out, radiating the hubris of a man who believed he had successfully crushed his own daughter to protect his legacy. Next to him, my mother. Claire buried her face in her hands and sobbed. To the untrained eye, it looked as though she was weeping out of shame for my disgraced entrance. But I knew the truth. I knew she was crying out of sheer terror, pride, and the overwhelming realization of the rebellion she had set into motion just hours before. They all thought I was walking to my own ruin. They thought the man sitting at the defense table, my golden boy brother, Harrison, looking perfectly relaxed in his bespoke suit, had won. His high-priced defense attorney was already standing, shuffling a stack of papers with a triumphant gleam in his eye, ready to ask the court for an immediate dismissal with prejudice. I walked silently down the center aisle, my chin held high, my spine rigid. I did not sit in the gallery. I walked directly to the prosecution's table, where Captain Sarah Hayes stood waiting, her posture demanding absolute respect. She gave me a single, imperceptible nod. "The trap was set, Your Honor," Harrison's attorney began, his voice dripping with condescension as he addressed the bench. "We are here to formally request the dismissal of all charges against Mr. Harrison Vance. The prosecution's case is built entirely on the fabricated digital evidence of a disgruntled, emotionally unstable family member. Furthermore, the defense has proven that Commander Vance acted out of severe psychological distress and deep-seated jealousy. We ask that this witch hunt be terminated immediately so my client can return to his vital work for our nation's defense." My father nodded approvingly from the first row. Harrison smirked, adjusting his silk tie. The Honorable Judge Thomas Mercer, a man known for his sharp intellect and zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics, slowly lowered his reading glasses. He looked at the attorney, then at Harrison, and finally at the sealed manila envelope resting in the center of his heavy mahogany desk. The silence in the room stretched, pulling taut like a wire about to snap. "Before I rule on the motion to dismiss," Judge Mercer's voice boomed, carrying a weight that made the air in the rooms suddenly feel incredibly thin. "The court must address a midnight evidentiary filing submitted by the Naval Inspector General's office. This evidence was obtained legally and has been authenticated by federal cyberforensics." Mercer paused, his piercing gaze shifting across the room until it locked directly onto me. "I am calling Commander Eleanor Vance to the stand." My father's mocking laugh died instantly in his throat. Harrison's smirk vanished, replaced by a sudden, sickly pallor. The attorney scrambled to his feet, objecting wildly. But Mercer slammed his gavel down with a deafening crack, ordering him to sit. I walked to the witness stand, the click of my heels ringing like gunshots in the breathless room. I placed my right hand on the Bible and swore the oath. Captain Hayes stepped forward as the acting prosecutor. She handed the bailiff a silver flash drive, the exact drive my mother had pulled from my father's safe the night before. The bailiff plugged it into the court's audio system. "Commander Vance," Captain Hayes said, her voice steady and commanding. "Can you identify the voices on this recording?" "I can," I replied clearly. Captain Hayes pressed play. The pristine, digitally enhanced audio filled the courtroom. First came the undeniable sound of my brother's arrogant laughter. "Relax, Dad. It's done." Harrison's voice echoed through the speakers. "The foreign buyers wired the first 10 million to the offshore shell this morning. The Navy's sonar coordinates are theirs." "And what about Eleanor?" My father's voice replied, cold and calculating, handled. "She's too emotional, too desperate for your approval." I used Grandpa's old codes to route the breach back to her sector. By the time her superiors figure it out, she'll be framed as a hysterical woman trying to frame her brother. She's a scapegoat. It was almost too easy. The courtroom erupted. Reporters in the back rows frantically began typing on their phones. The jury box gasped in collective horror. I looked directly at Harrison. He was shaking violently, his eyes darting toward the exits like a trapped animal. I then looked at my father, the great patriarch, the man who had demanded my submission for 3 decades, seemed to age 20 years in a matter of seconds. He collapsed backward into his wooden bench, his mouth opening and closing in silent, suffocated shock. His empire was dead, and right beside him, my mother. Claire lowered her hands from her face. She was no longer crying. She stood up, tall and unburdened, turned her back on my father, and walked out of the courtroom, finally a free woman. The checkmate was absolute. The aftermath was a masterclass in swift, unforgiving justice. Judge Mercer did not even wait for a recess. Based on the undeniable audio confession of espionage, treason, and conspiracy, he ordered the United States Marshals to take Harrison Vance into immediate custody. The metallic, heavy click of the handcuffs ratcheting around my brother's wrists was the loudest sound in the world. All his arrogance, all his wealth, and all his golden boy privilege evaporated the moment they stripped him of his tailored jacket and marched him out of the side doors. My father remained frozen in the front row, a hollow shell of a man, entirely abandoned by the family he had tried to rule through fear and manipulation. As I stepped down from the witness stand, Captain Hayes met me halfway. She didn't offer empty congratulations. She offered a crisp, perfectly executed salute, the highest form of respect an officer could give. I returned it, feeling the immense, crushing weight of the past 34 years finally lift from my shoulders. My badge, my clearance, and my honor were fully restored by sunset. The scene softly fades out, and the narrator Eleanor appears, sitting in a warm, inviting, and beautifully lit study, speaking directly to the camera with a profound sense of empathy and strength. "My beautiful friends," I say, leaning forward slightly, making direct eye contact with the lens. "What did we truly learn from this journey today? Sometimes, the absolute hardest, most grueling battles we will ever fight aren't against strangers in the dark, but against the people who share our own blood. From the moment we are born, we are conditioned to believe that family is everything. But let me be explicitly clear with you right now. Loyalty should never, ever cost you your integrity, your peace of mind, or your basic human rights. I was targeted by my own father and brother because they operated under a toxic, patriarchal assumption. They genuinely believed that as a woman, I would naturally bend to emotional pressure. They thought I would blindly seek their validation, that I would swallow my morals to keep the peace at the dinner table. But true power, true, unshakable equality, is realized the exact moment you stop asking for a seat at a table where you are not respected, and you decide to build your own. True equality means holding everyone to the exact same standard of justice, no matter their gender, their bank account, or their title in your family tree. And to those of you watching who might relate more to Claire, to my mother, who finally found her voice late in life, I want you to hear this. It is never too late to break a cycle of trauma. It is never too late to stand up. Forgiveness and truth go hand in hand. And the moment she chose to protect the truth, she healed herself. She proved that courage doesn't have an expiration date. Before I let you go today, I want to leave you with a crucial warning. Narcissism in families often hides brilliantly behind the mask of tradition or protecting the family legacy. If someone in your life asks you to compromise your morals to protect their dirty secrets, they do not love you. They are using you. Guard your boundaries fiercely, and never apologize for protecting your own light. If this story resonated with your heart today, if you have ever had to stand completely alone to stand up for what is right, please leave a white heart in the comments below. Let's build a community of support and healing right here. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because next week, I have a brand new, incredible story about a small-town baker who discovered a devastating secret that brought down a corrupt mayor. And trust me, you won't want to miss a single second of it. Stay strong, stay true to yourself, demand the respect you deserve, and I will see you in the next video. The days immediately following the trial were a torrential downpour of media frenzy and shattering realities. For 34 years, the Vance family name had been synonymous with untouchable American wealth, a gilded fortress built on defense contracts, political donations, and carefully curated public relations. In less than 48 hours, that fortress was reduced to ash and rubble. The federal government moves with a terrifying, absolute efficiency when its national security is compromised. By Monday morning, the Department of Defense had entirely blacklisted Vance Defense Solutions. All active military contracts were severed. The company's assets were frozen by federal marshals, and the board of directors initiated a catastrophic liquidation to salvage whatever pennies they could. The mighty empire my father had sacrificed my humanity to build dissolved into a mountain of subpoenas and bankruptcy filings. I watched the financial news segments on the muted television in the naval base cafeteria, sipping my black coffee as commentators dissected the spectacular, unprecedented collapse of Arthur and Harrison Vance. There was no joy in my heart as I watched the ticker tape announce the ruin of my family's legacy. There was only a profound, hollow exhaustion, the kind that settles deeply into your bones after surviving a war you never asked to fight. My brother's transition from a bespoke, suited millionaire to a federal inmate was brutal and swift. Harrison was denied bail, deemed a severe flight risk given his offshore connections and the treasonous nature of his crimes. The high-priced attorneys who had once laughed at me in the courtroom suddenly stopped returning his calls once the company accounts were frozen. He was transferred to a maximum security federal detention center to await formal sentencing, stripped of his sports cars, his penthouses, and his golden boy privilege. For the first time in his life, Harrison was forced to exist in a world where our father's money could not buy his way out of the consequences. As for my father, Arthur Vance was not indicted for the data theft itself, but the audio recording of his complicity destroyed his reputation permanently. He became a pariah in his own country club, ousted from his charitable boards, and abandoned by the sycophants who had only ever loved his checkbook. He was left entirely alone in that sprawling, cavernous estate, a king president over an empire of ghosts. He tried to call me once, leaving a rambling, bitter voicemail demanding that I issue a public statement to salvage his personal reputation. I didn't even listen to the end before hitting delete. My boundaries were no longer up for negotiation. The only beautiful thing to rise from the ashes of that week was the rebirth of my mother. When Claire walked out of that courtroom, she didn't just leave a toxic marriage. She walked into an entirely new existence. With Captain Hayes's quiet assistance, we helped my mother secure a modest, sunlit apartment on the other side of the city, far away from the suffocating shadows of the Vance estate. The first time I visited her new home, I stopped in the doorway, entirely overwhelmed by the sight before me. There were no heavy, intimidating mahogany antiques. There were no sterile, perfectly curated oil paintings meant to impress wealthy guests. Instead, the apartment was filled with vibrant, mismatched throw pillows, lush green ferns hanging by the windows, and the warm, golden smell of cinnamon and baking bread. My mother was standing in the small kitchen, wearing a simple pair of jeans and a loose sweater clothes my father would have deemed unacceptable. She was humming a soft, old jazz tune as she poured boiling water into a ceramic teapot. When she saw me, her face broke into a smile that reached all the way to her eyes, erasing a decade of premature aging. She poured us 2 cups of chamomile tea, and we sat on her soft, floral sofa, watching the afternoon sun filter through the glass. For the first time in my life, we actually talked. We didn't talk about my father's temper, and we didn't talk about Harrison's achievements. We talked about her childhood, her forgotten dreams of becoming a botanist, and her favorite books. She asked me about my work, not with dismissive, polite tolerance, but with genuine, burning curiosity. She wanted to know how I cracked the codes, how I felt when I wore my uniform, and what my hopes were for the future. As I sat there, leaning my head against her shoulder while she gently stroked my hair, I realized that I had finally found the mother I had been grieving my entire life. The tragedy of our family's destruction had birthed the most sacred, healing relationship I had ever known. We were 2 survivors, washing the soot from our faces, finally learning how to breathe the clean air. 6 months passed, and the bitter winter storms gave way to a bright, triumphant spring. The Navy did not just restore my security clearance. They recognized that my actions had saved the Pacific Fleet's stealth infrastructure from catastrophic, irreparable compromise. Admiral Richter, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, personally oversaw my promotion to the rank of captain. But more importantly, I was given the resources and authority to build an entirely new, elite cybersecurity division from the ground up. I named the unit the Sentinel Protocol, dedicating its mission to hunting down internal vulnerabilities and routing out corruption before it could bleed into the civilian sector. I handpicked my team, choosing brilliant, hungry young officers who had been previously overlooked by the bureaucratic machinery. I wanted a team that understood that true honor was not about blindly following orders, but about relentlessly seeking the truth, even when the truth was deeply uncomfortable. My new office was located in a secure, sun-drenched wing of the command center overlooking the deep, churning blue of the Pacific Ocean. I brought in a framed, black and white photograph of my grandfather and placed it proudly in the center of my desk. Every time I looked at his kind, weathered face, I no longer felt the sharp sting of Harrison's betrayal. Instead, I felt a deep, abiding connection to his legacy of integrity. I had taken the name Vance, dragged it through the mud of my father's corruption, and cleansed it in the fire of justice. I was the true heir to my grandfather's honor, and nobody could ever strip that away from me again. Captain Sarah Hayes, now a rear admiral, became a permanent fixture in my life, not just as a mentor, but as chosen family. She and my mother struck up an unlikely but fierce friendship, bonded by their shared resilience and their mutual protectiveness over me. We spent our weekends having dinner on my mother's small balcony, drinking cheap wine, and laughing until our sides ached, surrounded by a warmth and unconditional love that all of my father's millions could never have purchased. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 year after the trial, a thick cream-colored envelope arrived at my office. I recognized the sharp, aggressive handwriting immediately. It was from my father. I sat at my desk, listening to the rhythmic hum of the servers and the distant crashing of the waves outside my window. And I stared at the envelope. A year ago, a letter from Arthur Vance would have sent my heart rate skyrocketing. It would have triggered a cascade of anxiety, a desperate need to read his words, to parse through the insults looking for a tiny, buried scrap of validation. But as I held the heavy paper in my hands, I realized that the terrifying giant of my childhood had completely vanished. I felt nothing. No anger, no sorrow, no lingering desire for his approval. He was just a sad, broken man who had chosen greed over his own flesh and blood. I didn't open the letter. I didn't need to know if it was an apology, a curse, or another manipulative demand. I knew that allowing his voice back into my head, even for a paragraph, was a violation of the peace I had fought so fiercely to build. With a calm, steady hand, I fed the unopened envelope into the heavy-duty paper shredder beside my desk. The machine hummed, slicing his words into 1,000 unreadable ribbons. I watched the confetti fall into the bin, took a deep, cleansing breath of the salt-tinged air, and smiled. Later that evening, I walked out of the naval base in my dress uniform. The setting sun caught the silver insignia on my collar, glowing with a brilliant, unyielding light. I thought back to that young, terrified girl who used to shrink in the corners of the Vance estate, begging to be seen. She was gone. In her place stood a woman who had walked through the fire of her own family's betrayal and emerged with her soul completely intact. I had learned the most painful, beautiful lesson the universe has to offer. You do not need permission to be magnificent, and you do not need your family's applause to know your own worth. I walked toward my car, the evening breeze lifting the hair from my shoulders, stepping fully and completely into the beautiful, hard-won architecture of my own peace. The calendar on my desk marked exactly 18 months since the day my family's empire had crumbled under the weight of its own arrogance. The slow grinding machinery of the federal justice system had finally arrived at its inevitable destination, Harrison's formal sentencing hearing. I walked into the courthouse. But this time, the heavy oak doors did not feel like the entrance to a slaughterhouse. They felt remarkably ordinary. I was dressed in my standard service uniform, the crisp lines a comforting reminder of the order and purpose I had built my life upon. As I took my seat in the second row of the gallery, I noticed the stark emptiness of the room. The frantic reporters and sensationalist bloggers who had once swarmed the halls were long gone, having moved on to the next scandalous headline. My father, Arthur, was notably absent. I had learned through the grapevine that he rarely left his estate anymore, swallowed entirely by his own bitter isolation. The only people present were the prosecutors, a few court clerks, and Captain Sarah Hayes, who sat quietly beside me, a silent anchor of unwavering support. When the side door opened and the bailiff escorted my brother into the room, I almost did not recognize him. The Harrison Vance who used to command boardrooms and intimidate federal regulators was gone. The man wearing the faded, oversized orange jumpsuit looked remarkably small. His hair, once perfectly styled and thick, had thinned and grayed at the temples. His posture, which used to radiate a predatory confidence, was hunched, his shoulders curling inward as if he were trying to protect himself from invisible blows. As he sat at the defense table, his eyes darted toward the gallery. For a brief second, our gazes locked. I expected to see the familiar flare of hatred, the arrogant indignation of a man who believed he was above the law. Instead, I saw a profound, hollow exhaustion. He looked away quickly, staring down at his shackled hands. The tragedy of his situation hit me not with a wave of vengeance, but with a deep, tragic pity. He had traded his freedom, his honor, and his soul for a father's approval that had vanished the moment he was no longer useful. Judge Thomas Mercer presided over the sentencing with the same stern, absolute authority he had shown during the trial. He read through the final sentencing guidelines, detailing the devastating impact of the data breach and the meticulous, premeditated nature of the cover-up. When the time came, Judge Mercer looked over his reading glasses and addressed the prosecution's table. He asked if there was a victim impact statement to be read on behalf of the Navy. I stood up, smoothing the front of my jacket, and walked toward the podium. I didn't hold a piece of paper. I had not prepared a written speech. I looked directly at Judge Mercer. And then I turned slightly to look at the man who used to be my brother. Your Honor, I began, my voice steady and resonant in the quiet room. For 34 years, I was taught that the highest virtue a person could possess was loyalty to their family. I was conditioned to believe that this loyalty required absolute silence, absolute submission, and the complete surrender of my own moral compass. The man sitting at that defense table weaponized that conditioning. He stole from the nation that trusted him. And when he was caught, he attempted to destroy my life, fully expecting me to quietly absorb the blow because I was a woman, and because I was supposed to know my place in the shadows of his success. I paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. I am not here today to ask for vengeance. The loss of his family, his legacy, and his freedom is a prison of his own making. I am here to speak for the absolute necessity of justice. True justice is the only mechanism that can break generational cycles of toxic entitlement. It is the only light that can sanitize the dark corners where men like Harrison believe the rules do not apply to them. I asked the court to impose the maximum sentence, not out of malice, but to ensure that the message is unequivocal. No amount of wealth, and no family name, is a shield against the truth. Harrison closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his weathered cheek. It was the first honest emotion I had ever seen him display. Judge Mercer nodded slowly, a look of profound respect crossing his features. "Thank you, Captain Vance," he said softly. Minutes later, the gavel fell. Harrison Vance was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. As the bailiffs led him away, he did not look back. I watched the door close behind him, feeling the final, heavy lock turning on my past. I walked out of the courthouse with Captain Hayes into the bright afternoon sun, leaving the ghost of the Vance family behind forever. The slate was completely wiped clean. The ocean breeze, blowing through the open windows of the Naval Justice School in Newport, was tinged with the sharp, clean scent of salt and pine. I stood at the front of the massive lecture hall, looking out over a sea of 30 crisp, immaculate blue uniforms. These were the brightest young officers in the fleet, their faces open, eager and filled with the kind of unblemished idealism that the military so desperately relies upon. I placed my thick, worn binder on the wooden podium. It was labeled Operation Sentinel, containing the declassified case studies of a cyber espionage trial that had permanently altered the trajectory of my life. As I looked at these young men and women, I saw echoes of myself, officers who believed in the absolute purity of the law, entirely unaware of how violently that belief would eventually be tested. "Welcome to Advanced Cyber Ethics and Internal Threat Assessment," I announced, my voice projecting effortlessly to the back row. "Over the next 6 weeks, we are going to dissect the legal, technical, and psychological frameworks of high-level security breaches. We will study the digital footprints, the firewall architecture, and the forensic auditing protocols." I paused, stepping out from behind the podium to stand closer to the first row of desks. "But more importantly, we are going to study the human element. The most dangerous threats to our national security do not always come from foreign adversaries sitting in darkened rooms halfway across the globe. Sometimes, the most catastrophic threats come from the people sitting at your own dinner table. They come wrapped in the guise of loyalty, tradition, and familial duty." A young female ensign in the second row, whose name tag read Miller, raised her hand hesitantly. "Captain Vance, how do you prepare for a threat that uses your personal life as leverage? How do you separate your duty from your humanity?" I smiled warmly at her, recognizing the profound weight of her question. "You don't separate them, Ensign Miller. You align them." The hardest part of true justice is not tracking down the IP addresses or decoding the encrypted servers. The hardest part is having the courage to be seen for who you truly are, even if that means standing completely alone. I walked slowly down the center aisle, making direct eye contact with the students. You will all face a moment in your careers where doing the right thing will cost you something deeply personal. You will be pressured to look the other way, to soften a report, to protect a legacy, or to shrink yourself so someone else can feel powerful. When that moment comes, I want you to remember that your integrity is the only armor you truly own. Do not ever trade it for someone else's comfort. The class remained spellbound, absorbing the weight of a lesson that was not written in any textbook. When the lecture ended, a few students lingered to ask questions, their eyes shining with a deep, respectful admiration. As I packed up my binder and walked back to my office, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a text message from my mother, Claire. She had attached a photograph of a vibrant, blooming patch of heirloom tomatoes from her new community garden, along with a caption that read, "First harvest. Come over for dinner tonight. I'm making that pasta recipe we found. I love you, my brave girl." I typed back a quick, joyful reply, feeling a profound surge of gratitude warm my chest. My office was quiet, the late afternoon sun casting long, golden shadows across the polished floor. I sat at my desk and looked at the framed photograph of my grandfather, feeling a deep, settling peace. I thought about the terrified, invisible daughter I had once been, the woman who had walked into that courtroom, expecting to be crushed under the weight of her father's laughter. That woman had been forged in the fire, her insecurities burned away, leaving behind a foundation of solid, unyielding steel. The Vance Empire had fallen, but from its ruins, my mother and I had built something entirely indestructible. We had built a life defined not by wealth, patriarchal approval, or toxic loyalty, but by fierce independence, unconditional love, and the quiet, magnificent power of the truth. I closed my eyes, listening to the distant crash of the Atlantic waves against the shore, and for the first time in my entire life, I knew exactly who I was, and it was more than enough. As we close the chapter on Eleanor's incredible journey, I want us to take a deep breath and truly reflect on the emotional earthquake we just witnessed. From the moment we are born, society and culture drum a single, relentless message into our heads. Family is everything. We are told to keep the peace, to swallow our pride, and to sweep the toxic behavior of our loved ones under the rug to protect the family name. But Eleanor's story teaches us a devastatingly beautiful truth. Loyalty should never, ever be a currency that costs you your integrity, your peace of mind, or your self-worth. When Eleanor was pressured to shrink herself, she was expected to take the fall simply because she was the daughter, the one conditioned to sacrifice her own light for her brother's ambition. But she refused. She showed us that true, unshakable power isn't about raising your voice or throwing your weight around. It's about holding your ground when the ground beneath you is crumbling. And perhaps the most profound triumph in this story isn't just the justice served in that courtroom, but Claire the mother finally waking up. To anyone watching who relates to Claire, who feels like you have spent decades making yourself small so someone else could feel big, please hear this. It is never too late to break the spell. It is never too late to stand up, to protect what is right, and to walk out of a prison of your own making. Courage does not have an expiration date. Never let anyone use the word family as a weapon to manipulate you into silence. Guard your boundaries fiercely, demand the respect you deserve, and always trust your inner compass. This content has been manually researched, developed, and edited by our team to bring you meaningful lessons and value.